Did you know that Keith Moon once passed out mid-show after mixing sedatives with brandy, forcing The Who to pull a fan from the audience to finish the set? From Jim Morrison's chaotic Miami meltdown to Ozzy Osbourne's infamous Alamo incident, here are the 25 rock and roll stars too wasted to perform. Keith Moon. Keith Moon wasn't just a drummer. He was a walking hurricane of chaos. If there was a way to go overboard, Moon found it. Case in point, a 1973 show at the Cow Palace in California. He had apparently taken a cocktail of sedatives and brandy before the gig, which, surprise, surprise, didn't mix well with the high-energy demands of drumming for The Who. Mid-show, he slumped forward, completely out of it. The band, trying to hold the performance together, managed to revive him. Did it help? Not in the slightest. Moments later, he collapsed again, this time for good. Pete Townshend, never one to shy away from theatrics, decided to pluck some poor soul from the audience to take over. And that, folks, is how a fan got to live out every rock enthusiast's fantasy while Moon had an impromptu nap. Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison's performances were always unpredictable, but in 1969 at Miami's Dinner Key Auditorium, he didn't just cross the line, he obliterated it. Stumbling onto the stage completely plastered, Morrison spent more time antagonizing the audience than actually singing. He rambled, shouted obscenities, and then, in what may have been a chemically fueled haze of narcissism, decided that flashing the audience was a good idea. The show quickly spiraled into pure madness, with fans torn between outrage and sheer amusement. That little stunt led to a whole mess of legal trouble, including an arrest for indecent exposure. The once charismatic rock poet had turned into a self-sabotaging disaster, proving that while rock stars get away with a lot, even they have limits. By this point, Morrison's bandmates were exhausted by his downward spiral. His relationship with alcohol and substances had become impossible to manage, and the Miami fiasco only solidified his reckless reputation. Lawsuits, protests, and venue cancellations followed, making it clear that Morrison's self-destruction was catching up with him. Even for a band that thrived on controversy, this was a nightmare to handle. Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy Osbourne didn't just push the boundaries, he obliterated them, then set them on fire for good measure. The man who would go on to bite the head off a bat had already built a reputation for being perpetually wrecked. In 1982, he decided Texas needed to witness his particular brand of madness. Staggering through San Antonio in a dress, he found himself near the Alamo, where he did what any drunken rock star would apparently consider normal. He relieved himself on a monument. That was enough to earn him a legendary ban from the city. But his stage performances weren't much better. Fans who paid to see the Prince of Darkness often got an incoherent mess of a man, slurring through lyrics and stumbling across the stage like a zombie with inner ear problems. Black Sabbath had already struggled with his behavior, but his solo career was no different. Osbourne's ability to barely function on stage became part of his legend. And while his performances sometimes bordered on disaster, audiences kept coming back. His sheer unpredictability was part of the attraction, even if it was a train wreck in slow motion. Grace Slick. Grace Slick didn't just drink. She waged war against sobriety, and in 1978, Germany was the battlefield. Jefferson's Starship had a European tour to get through, but one night in Hamburg, things went spectacularly off the rails. Slick was so hammered she couldn't even make it on stage. The show was canceled, leaving fans furious. But Grace, she wasn't done. The following night, despite clearly not having learned a single lesson, she staggered onto the stage, still sloshed, and proceeded to insult the very audience that had paid to see her. German fans, known for their patience, were less than amused. The fallout was ugly, but let's be real, Grace Slick was never one to care about public perception. The only thing she regretted? Probably running out of booze before the show ended. Her bandmates weren't amused. This wasn't just another rock star meltdown, it was the kind of disaster that left a permanent mark. Jefferson Starship had to apologize, and the tour was nearly derailed. Slick's reputation as an unpredictable force of nature only grew, but at a steep cost. John Bonham. John Bonham played drums like a man possessed, but his drinking habits were a whole different level of extreme. By 1980, his alcohol intake had reached a point of no return. One particular drinking binge saw him consume a lethal amount of vodka, and instead of waking up with a nasty hangover, he simply never woke up at all. Led Zeppelin, recognizing that there was no replacing the man who gave their music its thunderous heartbeat, called it quits. Bonham's legacy as one of the greatest drummers in rock history remains untarnished. But his death was a tragic reminder that even the most unstoppable forces eventually burn out. Jim Reid of the Jesus and Mary Chain had a simple philosophy. If you're gonna be on stage, you might as well be drunk enough to barely function. For years, this strategy worked, until it didn't. Fans became accustomed to witnessing train wreck performances that teetered between brilliance and complete implosion. By 2007, even Reid himself admitted that his booze-fueled performances were no longer sustainable. But let's be honest, if you went to a Jesus and Mary Chain show expecting professionalism, you were clearly in the wrong place. Reid's legendary inebriation was both a selling point and a liability, proving that sometimes the most rock and roll thing a musician can do is barely hold it together. Bailey Zimmerman. Fast forward a year, and Bailey Zimmerman decided to throw his hat into the ring of wasted performers. He had a golden opportunity at a major festival, fans packed in like sardines, ready for a phenomenal show. Instead, they got a barely coherent mess, stumbling through a set that probably sounded better in his own head. The guy at least admitted he dropped the ball and promised to be better next time. But let's be honest, when a rock star says they're turning over a new leaf, odds are that leaf is still soaked in whiskey. Fans, of course, weren't thrilled. Social media exploded with complaints, with concert-goers wondering how an artist could show so little respect for the people who put him on that stage in the first place. Even worse, this wasn't some tiny bar gig. This was a massive festival with thousands of people expecting their money's worth. The backlash was brutal, and while Zimmerman tried to save face, the damage was done. The music world has a long memory, and fans don't forget being let down so easily. Puddle of Mudd. Wes Scantlin of Puddle of Mudd walked onto a stage in Toledo, Ohio, and proceeded to do the one thing a rock star should never do: make the rest of the band quit mid-show. How? By being so utterly trashed that they just gave up on him. Imagine paying for a concert and watching a train wreck unfold before your eyes. Fans booed, the band walked off, and Scantlin, well, let's just say he barely noticed. It wasn't the first time, and nobody was taking bets on it being the last. Over the years, Scantlin's downward spiral played out in public, with multiple on-stage breakdowns, arrests, and moments that left audiences stunned for all the wrong reasons. What should have been a band with a strong alt-rock legacy turned into a punchline. Concertgoers stopped showing up for the music and started showing up just to see if the night would end in disaster. Van Halen. The year was 1983. The U.S. festival was packed with rock fans ready to lose their minds, and Van Halen showed up like they pre-gamed for the apocalypse. The whole band had been drinking like it was their job, which honestly, it kind of was. David Lee Roth slurred through lyrics. Eddie Van Halen was fighting his guitar more than playing it, and what could have been an iconic moment turned into a legendary mess. The audience? Less than thrilled. The band? Probably too wasted to care. The Van Halen attitude had always been built on excess, but this was a new level. Rock concerts were supposed to be wild, but there was a difference between being wild and being completely incapable of playing a decent set. This wasn't the kind of show fans would look back on with nostalgia. It was the kind they'd remember for all the wrong reasons. Marilyn Manson. Marilyn Manson has always thrived on being a shock artist, but there's a difference between controlled chaos and an absolute train wreck. Too many times, he stumbled onto the stage looking like he had just crawled out of a nightmare, barely aware of his surroundings. Fans came expecting a sinister theatrical show, not a sluggish mess of a performance that barely made it past a few songs. 1 minute, he was mumbling through lyrics. The next, he was cutting the show short, leaving fans confused and disappointed. At some point, the madness stopped feeling intentional and started looking like a sad decline, making it painfully clear that the demon Manson had been battling all along might have been himself. The unpredictability of his shows once felt thrilling, but as time went on, it became clear that there was no act, no performance art, just a man struggling to keep it together. The stage, once his kingdom, had turned into a place where his weaknesses were put on full display. It wasn't just a single bad night. The pattern repeated itself. Rihanna. Even pop royalty isn't immune to a spectacular crash and burn, and Rihanna proved it in the middle of her 2013 tour. When she hit the stage in Perth, fans expected the powerful, commanding performer they had paid to see. Instead, they got someone who seemed to be existing in an entirely different reality. Off-key, missing beats, and looking like she'd rather be anywhere else, she fumbled through a performance that had the internet buzzing for all the wrong reasons. Some blamed exhaustion, others speculated about what might have been in her system, but the verdict was clear. This was a train wreck. Fans stuck by her because she's Rihanna, but that night, the crown definitely slipped. What made the performance all the more frustrating was how avoidable it seemed. Rihanna is a powerhouse, a performer with incredible stage presence and a discography packed with hits that should have made for an unforgettable night. Instead, the audience was left watching someone who appeared checked out entirely. The notes weren't just off, they were unrecognizable. Slash. Guns N' Roses didn't earn their reputation for behaving like choir boys, and Slash was their most infamous ambassador of excess. The man could play guitar like nobody else, but sometimes he was so far gone that even he couldn't save himself. One of the worst nights unfolded at the Ritz in New York, a venue that should have witnessed a historic show, but instead got a drunken mess. Stumbling through solos, missing notes, and barely standing upright, Slash turned what should have been a masterclass in rock into an embarrassing public meltdown. He eventually sobered up, but there were too many nights where he lost the fight to the bottle. For every incredible performance, there's at least one that people remember for all the wrong reasons. Slash's talent was never in question. When he was on, he was untouchable. But the nights when he wasn't, those were hard to watch. His guitar, usually an extension of himself, became something he struggled to control. On particularly bad nights, he would drag out solos to the point where they lost all meaning, stretching them far beyond what the songs required, as if he was stalling, trying to regain control. Keith Urban. Early in his career, Keith Urban was on the fast track to becoming a cautionary tale rather than a country superstar. His battles with alcohol and other substances weren't just tabloid gossip. They showed up in his performances. Slurred words, missed notes, and a distant, vacant look in his eyes made it clear he was spiraling. The talent was there, but he was barely holding on. Thankfully, he got the wake-up call he needed before his career turned into nothing but a tragic what-if. He pulled himself together, got sober, and reclaimed his place in music. But there are still plenty of performances that serve as a reminder of just how close he came to losing it all. Keith Urban's struggle wasn't just about addiction, it was about an artist who almost let his gift slip through his fingers. The moments on stage where he seemed disconnected, almost robotic, weren't just bad nights, they were warnings. Fans could see it. His voice, usually rich and full of emotion, lacked conviction. Neil Young. Neil Young is one of the greatest songwriters of all time, but even legends have their breaking points. When his bandmate Danny Whitten died, the grief pushed Young into a downward spiral that bled onto the stage. What followed was a series of tours where he was barely present, often drowning in alcohol and emotions too heavy to carry. The audience could feel it. His performances lost their fire, replaced by something messy and heartbreaking. It wasn't just about a rock star partying too hard. It was watching someone wrestle with pain in real time. Neil eventually found his way back, but that dark chapter in his career still lingers as a reminder of how quickly things can unravel. Some bands drink a little too much before a show. The Replacements made it their entire personality. At their peak, their gigs were more like reckless free-for-alls than actual performances. Songs would start and never finish. Lyrics were forgotten. Instruments were abandoned mid-set. Depending on the night, you might get the best show of your life, or a drunken disaster that made you wish you had stayed home. It was all part of their charm, but at some point, even their most devoted fans had to admit this wasn't rock and roll rebellion. It was just self-destruction disguised as entertainment. Amy Winehouse. Amy Winehouse wasn't just a singer. She was a force of nature with a voice that could shatter hearts. But her battles with the bottle made headlines almost as often as her music did. There were nights she took the stage barely able to stand, slurring lyrics that once dripped with raw emotion. Fans would hold their breath, hoping she'd pull it together, but more often than not, they were met with a tragic spectacle. When she wasn't canceling shows last minute, she was stumbling through them like a lost soul drowning in excess. Promoters and bandmates tried everything, pleading, threatening, even pulling her off the stage mid-show when things got unbearable. The rare times she delivered a strong performance, it was a reminder of the brilliance that was slipping away. But those moments became fewer and fewer until the world woke up to the inevitable news. Another star taken too soon by her own vices. Kings of Leon. You drop a chunk of your hard-earned cash to see one of your favorite bands, expecting an epic night of music, only for the lead singer to call it quits halfway through the show. That's exactly what went down in Dallas when Caleb Followill of Kings of Leon wandered off stage, mumbling something about needing a drink. The official story? Vocal issues. The real story? The guy was too wasted to function. Fans stood there, confused at first, then just straight up pissed. The rest of the band tried to salvage the mess, but really, what can you do when your frontman ditches mid-performance? That's not just an off night, that's a public implosion. And it didn't end there. The backlash was so bad that the band had to hit the pause button for a while, trying to sweep the disaster under the rug. Spoiler, it took them years to recover from the PR nightmare. The worst part, this wasn't some underground garage band getting too carried away with the free booze. This was Kings of Leon, a massive act with stadiums full of fans expecting more than a meltdown. Rock stars flaming out is nothing new, but usually they at least make it through the show before self-destructing. This was a textbook case of how to torch your own reputation in real time. And sure, they bounced back eventually, but let's be real. Some fans never forgot the night their ticket bought them nothing but disappointment. Call it rock and roll, call it self-sabotage. But one thing's for sure, when the lead singer taps out mid-gig, nobody wins. Billie Joe Armstrong. Billie Joe Armstrong wasn't the kind of guy to just stand there and take it. When Green Day's set got cut short at the iHeartRadio Music Festival in the early 2010s, he didn't just complain, he exploded. He cursed out the industry, smashed his guitar, and made sure everyone knew he was not some teen pop star. It was a meltdown that people couldn't stop talking about. But let's be real, this wasn't just about the music getting cut. Armstrong was already on the edge, and this was the moment where it all cracked wide open. People love a rebellious frontman, but there's a fine line between wild and out of control. And that night, he crossed it. Turns out he wasn't just mad, he was struggling, and it showed. Not long after, he checked into rehab, facing the consequences of years spent living on the edge. Fans who had once cheered his raw energy now saw something different, a man hitting rock bottom in real time. It could have been the final chapter, the point where everything unraveled for good, but instead it became a turning point. Even with all the rage, that moment still stands as one of rock's unforgettable breakdowns, proof of how fast things can spiral when the pressure is too much. Scott Weiland. Scott Weiland's story wasn't just about struggle. It was about years lost to something he couldn't shake. As the frontman of Stone Temple Pilots, he had a voice that defined an era. But as time went on, that voice started to fade. Some nights he barely made it through a set, mumbling through the songs that once made crowds go wild. Other times, he was so out of it that his bandmates had to pick up the slack. Nobody ever really knew what version of Weiland would show up, and that became the only thing predictable about him. Layne Staley's voice was haunting even before his addiction started stealing his soul. By the time Alice in Chains was struggling to keep him on tour, he was already fading away. Some performances were so painful to watch that even die-hard fans couldn't pretend everything was okay. He could barely hold the microphone some nights, let alone hit the notes that once carried an entire generation of grunge. His bandmates watched helplessly as he drifted further into the abyss, his talent suffocating under the weight of illegal substances. In the end, it wasn't just his music that suffered, it was his life. Anyone who had followed his trajectory saw the writing on the wall long before the final curtain fell. There were glimpses of brilliance still buried under the haze, but they were fleeting, overshadowed by the reality of what his addiction had done. The band tried to move forward, but the heart of Alice in Chains was gone, leaving behind only echoes of what had been. Hank Williams Sr. Hank Williams Sr. wasn't just a country legend. He was the blueprint for every hard-living, whiskey-soaked musician who came after him. But his love affair with alcohol turned him into his own worst enemy. He missed shows, stumbled through the ones he did make, and turned every performance into a gamble. Fans who came to hear his iconic twang sometimes got a man too wasted to hold a guitar properly. The tragic part? He never got the chance to fix it. His career ended the same way it had been spiraling for years, in a haze of alcohol and regret. Long before rock and roll made self-destruction an art form, Williams had already written the book. His short-lived career was as brilliant as it was tragic, a cautionary tale for every musician who thought they could outdrink their demons. His voice, raw and filled with emotion, remains legendary, but the man behind it never got to see just how far his influence would reach. His name is still revered, but the price he paid to be remembered was higher than anyone should have to pay. Janis Joplin. Janis Joplin didn't just sing, she bled emotion into every note. But behind the fearless, raspy-voiced powerhouse was a woman battling demons she couldn't escape. When she was at her best, she was untouchable. When she was at her worst, the audience didn't know if they were witnessing magic or a breakdown in real time. Some nights, her performances were legendary. Other nights, she could barely stand, let alone belt out the blues that made her famous. Her unpredictability made her a thrilling but tragic figure. Her raw power on stage could mesmerize an audience, but the same chaotic energy fueled her downfall. Industry insiders whispered about her lifestyle, but nobody could tell her to slow down. The same fire that made her unforgettable also made her reckless, and eventually, it consumed her. When the music stopped, it stopped forever, leaving behind a void that nobody has ever truly filled.